welcome to the deep dive. You've shared a really comprehensive report with us, this deep analysis looking into the political contributions and expenditures of George Soros and, well, the network of organizations connected to him.
That's right.
Our goal in this deep dive is basically to pull out the most important insights from all this data for you, the listener.
Exactly. It's a vast amount of information you've provided, and our aim is to guide you through it so you can clearly see the big picture.
Okay.
Things like the scale of this financial activity, how it's all structured, and its pretty clear partisan direction, along with its wider impact.
So we're looking at, well, everything, really. From Soros' own personal donations right through to the spending by some key entities. That includes Soros Fund Management, which, as we'll see, is more like a marker for individual contributions from him, his family, employees.
Right, SFM.
Then there's the massive Open Society Foundation's OSF.
Yes, OSF. And its advocacy arm, the Open Society Policy Center, OSPC.
Okay. And finally, we'll also cover the roles of the affiliated political action committees, specifically Democracy PAC and Democracy PAC 2.
And this isn't just about what's happening at the federal level, right?
No, exactly. The report you shared also examines activities at the state and even local levels across the U.S.
And it touches on international spending as well, so it's a truly broad scope we're delving into.
Okay, let's start by trying to get our heads around this network of organizations. It could feel a bit like trying to follow the threads in a really complex tapestry.
It can seem that way.
First up is Soros Fund Management, or SFM. Now, the firm itself doesn't make organizational political contributions, but it's a really important indicator, isn't it?
Absolutely. When you see political contributions linked to SFM, it generally signifies individual donations, usually from George Soros himself, members of his family, or individuals employed by the firm.
Okay.
And these individual contributions are actually quite substantial. In the 2024 election cycle alone, based on the data we have, those connected to SFM add up to, a significant $4.47 million.
That's a considerable amount coming just from individuals. Then we have the Open Society Foundation's OSF. This is the really big player, I gather.
Yeah.
With influence stretching right across the globe.
Precisely. The OSF is a huge philanthropic network, just massive. Since its inception back in 1993, it has distributed over $23 billion worldwide.
Wow, $23 billion?
Yeah. Supporting a really diverse range of causes, everything from justice and education to public health and independent media, to name just a few.
Yeah.
In 2023 alone, their global expenditure was $1.7 billion, with about $401 million of that being spent right here in the U.S.
And Soros himself has personally transferred an incredible amount of his own wealth to the OSF, hasn't he? The report mentioned something like $18 billion back in 2017.
Yes, that's correct. That massive personal investment really highlights the sheer scale of his philanthropic ambitions.
Right.
Now, while the OSF's primary focus is philanthropy, the grants it provides to various organizations, they often support advocacy and policy work.
Oh, okay.
Which, as you can imagine, frequently has political implications.
Which leads us neatly to the Open Society Policy Center, OSPC. This seems to be the more direct advocacy arm of the operation.
Exactly. As a 501c4 organization, and maybe for listeners who aren't familiar, 501c4s, unlike the charitable 501c3s, they have greater freedom to engage in political advocacy and lobbying.
Right. More direct politics.
Yeah. So the OSPC can be much more directly involved compared to the more purely charitable arms of OSF.
Okay.
What's particularly interesting is how it channels significant funds originating from the broader OSF network to other politically active nonprofit groups. In 2021, that amounted to around $140 million, and it was $138 million in 2020. Big numbers.
That kind of money is often referred to as dark money, isn't it? Because the original source of the funds can be a bit harder to trace.
That's often the case, yeah. This structure can allow for substantial funding of political causes without the same level of public disclosure you'd see with direct campaign contributions.
Makes sense.
It's also worth noting that several of George Soros' children serve on the board of OSPC, indicating, continued family involvement in this aspect of the network.
And then we come to the super PACs, Democracy PAC and Democracy PAC 2. These are the big hitters when it comes to influencing federal elections, I take it.
Precisely. These are federal super PACs, and just to clarify, unlike traditional PACs, Super PACs can raise and spend unlimited sums of money to overtly advocate for or against political candidates.
Though they can't directly coordinate with the campaigns themselves.
Right, that's the key distinction.
Yeah.
And these are primarily funded by Soros himself, or entities he controls, like the Fund for Policy Reform, which has links back to OSF.
Okay.
Soros has made some exceptionally large contributions here, including that massive $125 million.
I saw that.
Followed by another $50 million to Democracy PAC 2 in the lead-up to the 2022 midterm elections.
And these PACs don't necessarily spend all that money directly on campaign ads themselves, do they? The report suggested they often fund other groups.
That's a crucial point to understand, yeah. Their main strategy seems to be making very large contributions to other major liberal and Democratic super PACs. Yeah, groups like the Senate Majority PAC and the House Majority PAC. They then handle the direct spending on campaigns.
So Democracy PAC is like a major hub, collecting funds and then distributing them.
You could think of it that way, yeah. Distributing them to various specialized groups on the ground who are running different aspects of the campaign effort.
The report also mentions several other significant organizations that receive funding from Soros and OSF, such as the Center for American Progress and American Bridge 21st Century.
Yes, the list is quite extensive, actually. Those are just a couple of prominent examples. There are many think tanks, advocacy organizations, and other PACs that receive either direct contributions or grants to support their various political or, advocacy goals.
So looking at this entire network, it's clear that it's structured to provide maximum flexibility. Is that fair? Directing funds where they're needed, using different legal avenues.
Exactly. To achieve influence across the political landscape.
It's a multifaceted approach.
It really is. It allows for influence at various levels, from directly supporting individual candidates to that large-scale spending in federal elections, and then the less transparent funding of politically active nonprofits via OSPC.
Okay, let's drill down a bit now, specifically on the U.S. federal contributions and spending. We've already touched on the direct contributions from Soros and individuals linked to SFM.
Right, the $4.47 million in the current cycle.
It seems this has been an ongoing practice for quite some time.
Yes, the data shows a long history of these direct contributions going back many years. And while the individual amounts are smaller when you compare them to the sums channeled through the super PACs, they are still significant. They provide direct financial support to candidates' campaigns and the party infrastructure, like the DNC, DSCC, DCCC.
Right.
In the 2024 cycle so far, those individuals linked to SFM have contributed over $4.4 million. And as the report indicates, the overwhelming majority of that have gone to Democratic Party committees and liberal outside groups.
And then there's the super PAC funding, which really seems to have scaled up, particularly in the more recent election cycles, through Democracy PAC and Democracy PAC 2.
Absolutely.
Let's start by looking at the 2020 cycle. What did that look like?
Okay, so in 2020, Democracy PAC raised approximately $81.4 million. A lot of that came from the Fund for Policy Reform, which we mentioned is linked to OSF.
Right.
It then spent just under $81.1 million, making significant contributions to groups like the Senate Majority PAC. They got $11.5 million. Priorities USA Action got $5.5 million. House Majority PAC got $4 million.
And Soros himself put money in directly, too.
Yes. He personally donated $28.3 million directly to Democracy PAC during that election cycle.
Then came the 2022 cycle, and this is where we saw that really substantial increase in super PAC funding, primarily through the new one, Democracy PAC 2.
That's right. A huge jump. Soros made those very large contributions directly to Democracy PAC 2. $125 million in September 2021, and another $50 million in November 2022.
So $175 million just from him to that one PAC.
Correct. Now, interestingly, while Democracy PAC 2 raised a total of $155.9 million in that cycle, it actually spent only $17.5 million directly.
Huh, okay. Where did that go?
Its largest single contribution was $6 million to the Senate Majority PAC.
And the original Democracy PAC, was it still active?
Yes, the original Democracy PAC was also active in the 22 cycle. It raised and spent about $25.3 million. Its largest contribution also went to the Senate Majority PAC, $8 million in this instance.
So combined, they spent around $42.8 million in the 2022 cycle.
That's the figure, yes. Combined direct spending by both PACs, much less than raised, especially by PAC 2, suggesting a lot was held or transferred elsewhere.
And what about the early data for the 2024 cycle? It looks like these PACs are still playing a significant role.
Very much so. As of the latest data, so mid-2024, Democracy PAC had already received $60.7 million and spent $37.3 million. That included some notable contributions like $10 million to FF PAC, $7.5 million again to Senate Majority PAC.
And Democracy PAC, too.
Democracy PAC 2 started the cycle with a very large carryover balance from 22, given it hadn't spent all that money. And it had spent over $13 million so far, again, with significant contributions like $2.5 million to Senate Majority PAC and over $2 million to AB PAC, which is American Bridge.
So when we look at the bigger picture of federal spending, it appears Soros has really become maybe the major individual donor in recent years.
Absolutely. In the 2021-2022 election cycle, George Soros was the top individual federal donor, period.
Wow.
Yep, contributing a total of $178.8 million. The vast majority of that, $176.75 million, was in the form of what's often called outside money funds to groups like super PACs.
Right, not the direct contribution.
Exactly. Only about $2 million was direct contributions to candidates and parties, subject to limits. And this was a significant jump compared to earlier cycles. The report notes he was like #7 in 2018 and only #20 in 2020 if you just looked at direct hard money.
So the federal spending strategy seems pretty clear then. Direct contributions to support campaigns and parties directly, but the real financial firepower comes from the super PACs.
Right.
Which are then used to channel massive amounts of money to other Democratic-aligned groups, ultimately aiming to influence control of Congress and presumably presidential races.
That's a concise and accurate way to summarize the federal strategy that emerges from the data.
Yes. Okay. Now let's shift our focus a bit to the U.S. state and local contributions and spending. The report mentions that tracking this level of activity is, well, trickier.
It is definitely more challenging, yeah. The reporting requirements are much more fragmented across the different states and even cities and counties. It makes getting a single, complete picture much harder than at the federal level.
But we can still see patterns.
Oh, yes. We can still piece together a significant overview. We definitely see evidence of direct contributions to prominent Democratic candidates running for state-level offices, governors, attorneys general, and so on. And also substantial contributions to state Democratic parties in a whole range of states.
The report gave some specific examples, I think. Governors like Roy Cooper in North Carolina, Gavin Newsom in California.
That's right. And people like Beto O'Rourke in Texas during his runs. Plus, significant funding for state Democratic parties in key states like Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, Texas, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Minnesota, even New York.
And there was also mention of the Texas Majority PAC. What was that about?
Yes, the Texas Majority PAC is an interesting case. It was actually formed after the 2022 election cycle, and it was largely funded by Democracy PAC 2.
Ah, so channeling federal super PAC money down to the state level.
Exactly. Its primary goal seems to be building stronger Democratic infrastructure within Texas by coordinating donations to various county-level Democratic parties there, sort of a long-term infrastructure play.
Now, one area that really stood out in the report, maybe because it's been in the news a lot, was the apparent focus on district attorney races. This seems to be a particularly significant priority.
It absolutely is. It's become a major focus. Over the past decade, it's estimated that at least $40 million, maybe even $50 million or more, in funding linked to Soros has been directed towards these DA races.
And this is all theirs.
The underlying goal is quite clear: to help elect progressive prosecutors who are committed to implementing criminal justice reform measures. Things like reducing incarceration, ending cash bail, diverting low-level offenses.
Right. And what's particularly insightful here isn't just the total amount of money, maybe, but the strategic focus on these specific races.
Exactly. Unlike, say, presidential campaigns that get massive attention and cost billions, these DA races often fly under the radar for many voters and donors.
So you can have a bigger impact with less money, relatively speaking.
Precisely. It shows a really nuanced understanding of how systemic change can be pursued at the local level by changing who's in charge of implementing the law day to day.
And the report provided a pretty extensive list of specific candidates who received substantial financial support, right? Often making up a very large percentage of their total campaign funds.
Yes, absolutely. Names like Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, Kim Foxx in Chicago, George Gascon in Los Angeles, Alvin Bragg in Manhattan. These are probably the most well-known examples. But the report details many more across various cities and counties throughout the country. This targeted investment has indeed led to the election of numerous prosecutors who have gone on to implement significant policy changes in line with those reform goals.
But it's also generated quite a bit of controversy, hasn't it?
Oh, definitely. This strategy has generated considerable controversy. Critics often point to rising crime rates in some of these jurisdictions following the implementation of reforms.
Is there a direct link shown in the report?
Well, the report outlines the criticism and the debate around it. Proving direct causation between specific policies and citywide crime trends is obviously very complex, and there are many factors involved. But the criticism is certainly a major part of the story here.
Okay.
And by one estimate mentioned in the report, prosecutors who have received significant financial backing linked to Soros now oversee jurisdictions that account for a substantial portion of the total U.S. population, maybe around 20%.
20%. That's significant reach.
It is.
It's certainly a strategy that has drawn a lot of attention and sparked a lot of debate. Another key area of state and local spending highlighted in the report is on ballot measures. Soros seems to be a major player in funding these initiatives as well.
Yes, absolutely. He has been a significant funder of state ballot measure campaigns for many decades, actually, particularly those focused on issues like drug policy reform, marijuana legalization being a big one, and broader criminal justice reform.
The report mentions a figure of at least $80 million spent just on efforts related to marijuana legalization since way back in 1994.
That's the figure cited, yes. It shows a long-term commitment to that specific policy change through direct democracy.
And there were specific examples of supported ballot measures in states like California Prop 64, 36.5, 19.
Right. Multiple measures over the years in California. Also Colorado, Washington, Massachusetts.
Florida, too. Amendment 4 on felon voting rights.
Yes. $1.5 million went towards that effort in Florida. And others in Louisiana on unanimous juries. Michigan, on abortion rights Prop 3, got $4.5 million from OSPC.
Ah, OSPC again.
Yes, Ohio, Oklahoma. The list goes on.
Oh.
And the Open Society Policy Center, the 501c4, has played a particularly significant role in funding these ballot measure campaigns.
How significant?
Well, in 2021 alone, OSPC contributed $140 million to various causes, including ballot measures. That really highlights the scale of this particular activity separate from direct candidate support.
So when we try to get an overall sense of the state and local spending, it's clearly substantial, even though getting a precise total figure seems to be quite difficult.
It is tough to pin down exactly. FollowTheMoney.org, which tracks state-level data, has identified nearly $70 million in spending linked to Soros over a 24-year period. But the report suggests, and it seems likely, that this undercounts the actual total, especially when you factor in spending through state-level PCs and the 501c organizations like OSPC, which aren't always captured in standard campaign finance databases.
Right.
However, the overall pattern is quite clear. Targeted financial investments aimed at achieving progressive policy outcomes, either by influencing key positions like district attorneys or directly enacting changes to laws through ballot initiatives.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's try to take a step back again and look at the aggregated U.S. contributions and spending totals across all levels, federal, state, and local. It sounds like pinning down an exact figure is a really complex task.
It is indeed extremely challenging. You've got the different reporting requirements at each level, the use of various funding vehicles, direct contributions, super PACs, 501c4s.
Yeah, tracking it all is tough.
Very. However, based on the data compiled in the report, we can provide some estimated ranges. It's not precise, but gives a sense of scale.
Okay, what are we looking at?
For federal spending, let's say between 2017 and mid-2024, a reasonable estimate would likely fall somewhere in the range of $250 million to perhaps $350 million, maybe even a bit more.
Okay, $250 to $350 million federal, and state and local.
For state and local spending during that same period, it's even fuzzier, but a conservative estimate might be in the range of $100 million to $250 million, perhaps higher.
So adding those up very roughly.
Well, you also have to remember those significant contributions from the Open Society Policy Center to other politically active groups.
Right, the $140 million in 2021, $138 million in 2020.
Exactly. Those don't always fall neatly into direct campaign spending categories, but are clearly politically focused.
So you try to combine all these different streams.
A reasonable overall estimate for the total U.S. political and advocacy-related expenditures linked to Soros, say, since 2017, would likely fall somewhere in the range of $400 million to perhaps $600 million, maybe more.
$400 to $600 million since 2017.
That sort of range seems plausible based on the pieces we can see, and this generally aligns with the figure of around $500 million that has been reported elsewhere as spent just since January 2020.
Okay.
But it's really important to remember that distinction between direct campaign finance, which is generally more transparent, and the broader funding of politically active nonprofit organizations where the money trail can be harder to follow.
Right. So when we talk about political spending, it's a broad term here, covering both direct electioneering and this less direct advocacy funding.
Yes, exactly. It encompasses both.
Okay, now let's talk about where all this money is actually going in terms of political affiliation. The report seems very clear on the partisan distribution of these U.S. contributions.
Absolutely unambiguous, really. The data overwhelmingly demonstrates that the vast, vast majority of these financial resources are directed towards the Democratic Party, Democratic candidates, and a wide array of liberal or progressive organizations and causes.
The federal data seems particularly stark. Didn't the report say nearly 100% of identifiable partisan spending went to Democratic and liberal groups in the 2022 cycle?
Yes, essentially 100%. And even when we look at those individual contributions linked back to SFM in the early stages of the 2024 cycle, it's running at over 95% going to Democrats or liberal groups.
And the super PACs.
The democracy PACs themselves are explicitly liberal super PACs by definition and registration, and their spending patterns, primarily funding other major Democratic-aligned groups like Senate and House Majority PACs, fully confirm this partisan alignment. There's no ambiguity there.
And this holds true at the state and local level, too.
Yes. The data from state and local levels, while, as we've discussed, is more fragmented, also reveals a completely consistent pattern. Financial support goes to Democratic candidates for state and county offices, state and local Democratic Party organizations, and progressive ballot measures. And the grants distributed by the OSPC also predominantly target Democratic and progressive organizations.
So if we had to put a rough percentage on it, across the board, identifiable partisan spending, it sounds like well over 99% goes to support Democratic and liberal causes.
That's a fair and accurate assessment based on the report's findings. Over 99%.
Virtually nothing for Republicans or conservatives.
Virtually nothing in recent decades. The report even mentions a sort of historical footnote, a very small contribution from a family member to a Republican candidate decades ago. But that's really an exception proving the rule. For all practical purposes in recent times, it's entirely focused on one side of the aisle.
And the rationale behind this very strong partisan focus seems to be quite clearly linked to George Soros's open society philosophy, as the report frames it.
Yes, that seems to be the driving principle. His philosophical framework places a strong emphasis on values such as human rights, accountable government, the rule of law, social justice.
Okay.
And in the current U.S. political landscape, that aligns very closely with the core platform and priorities of the Democratic Party.
So the issues he prioritizes.
Exactly. Issues like criminal justice reform, action on climate change, economic equity, protecting voting rights. These are predominantly championed by Democrats in the United States today.
And he's been quite outspoken against certain Republicans.
Yes. Furthermore, he has also been quite explicit in his opposition to certain Republican figures and policies that he perceives as posing a threat to these core values of an open society. So it's both in alignment with Democratic positions and in opposition to certain Republican ones.
It's interesting to see how that philosophy translates into these concrete funding decisions, like the focus on DAs for criminal justice reform, or maybe funding for independent media.
Absolutely. The support for independent media internationally, for example, directly reflects that open society principle of needing an informed citizenry to hold power accountable. It's not just about partisan politics in a narrow sense. It's about promoting a specific vision of how society should function.
Right. Given that open society philosophy, though, does the report offer any insights into why there isn't maybe more funding directed towards nonpartisan initiatives? Or perhaps even moderate voices within the Republican Party who might align on certain aspects, like rule of law?
That's a good question. The report focuses mainly on where the money does go, which is overwhelmingly partisan Democrat liberal. It doesn't delve deeply into the counterfactual of why not others. One could speculate it's about perceived efficacy or perhaps a judgment that the threats to an open society as he defines them currently emanate much more strongly from one side. But the report itself primarily documents the existing pattern.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's broaden our view again and touch on the international political spending and activities undertaken by the Open Society Foundations. They have a truly massive global presence, don't they?
Indeed. It's huge. The OSF operates in well over 100 countries around the world. They have a vast network of regional and country-specific foundations.
And the total spending is?
Their total expenditures since the organization's founding exceed that $23 billion figure we mentioned earlier.
Right.
And in the year 2023 alone, approximately $1.3 billion was spent on international activities.
$1.3 billion internationally in 1 year.
Yes. And this spending primarily takes the form of grants to various non-governmental organizations, NGOs, civil society groups.
Working on what kinds of issues?
A really wide array. The primary focus is on providing financial support to organizations that are actively working on promoting democracy, protecting human rights, advancing justice and the rule of law, fostering education, and supporting independent media outlets.
Which sounds like philanthropy, but...
Well, while it is framed as philanthropic activity, it's important to recognize that this type of work often directly intersects with the political sphere in the countries where OSF operates. Supporting these ideals and the organizations that work on them can certainly be seen as having political implications, especially if you're supporting groups pushing for reforms that the current government opposes or groups acting as watchdogs. It depends heavily on the specific context and, frankly, who you asked.
Right. The report provided a few examples of this international activity. A mention of significant support in post-communist Eastern European countries.
Yes, that was a major focus early on, supporting transitions to democracy, and funding for institutions like the Central European University, which itself became a political issue, leading to its move from Hungary.
Okay. What other examples?
The report also mentions support provided to various groups that opposed Brexit in the United Kingdom, and substantial grants to international organizations like the International Crisis Group, which works on conflict prevention, and Global Witness, which focuses on corruption and natural resource governance. And the OSF also established the Open Society University Network with a very substantial endowment, $1 billion, I think, to promote international cooperation in higher education.
It sounds like quantifying the amount of explicitly political spending in the international context would be quite difficult, maybe even impossible.
Extremely difficult, yes. The lines are very blurry. Is supporting human rights lawyers defending dissidents philanthropy or politics? Is funding independent media politics?
It depends who you ask.
Exactly. But the overall financial commitment is clearly enormous. The sheer size of the OSF's international budget allows it to empower a vast number of groups that can act as checks on government power, advocate for specific policy changes, promote democratic values.
Which can lead to pushback.
Absolutely. It's understandable that governments, particularly in more authoritarian contexts, often view this type of activity as unwelcome political intervention. And this has unfortunately led to restrictions, government criticism, and even the forced closure or expulsion of OSF offices and funded organizations in some countries like Russia or Turkey.
Okay. Finally, let's try to get a sense of the grand total estimated contributions, both in the United States and internationally. It sounds like that figure of over $23 billion for total OSF expenditure since its founding is the most comprehensive number to keep in mind.
Yes, that figure really represents the overall scale of George Soros's organized giving through this entire network over several decades. It's the big umbrella number.
Right.
And it's crucial to understand that the estimated U.S. political spending we've discussed, that $400, $600 million range since 2017, for instance, is largely funded by or channeled through the OSF network in various ways.
So you can't just add the U.S. political spending on top of the $23 billion.
No, definitely not. That would result in significant double counting. The $23 billion figure already encompasses the OSF's global philanthropic activities, its own operational costs, grants made within the U.S., including those that support advocacy groups, and funding for entities like the Fund for Policy Reform, which, as we saw, is a major source of money for the democracy PACs.
Got it. So the U.S. political stuff is kind of a subset, funded from within that larger $23 billion pot.
Broadly speaking, yes. It's part of the overall deployment of resources managed through the OSF structure.
So while George Soros is undoubtedly a major political donor within the United States, his global financial activities through the Open Society Foundations are on a vastly larger scale. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely. Impacting a huge range of issues and organizations all around the world.
His vision for what he terms an open society is pursued through a truly global network.
With a financial footprint that is, frankly, immense.
Well, this has been a really fascinating and definitely in-depth look into the complex world of George Soros's political and philanthropic spending.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. So to summarize the key insights for our listeners, Soros utilizes a highly intricate network of organizations, SFM, OSF, OSPC, the PAC-8, to channel very significant financial resources into U.S. politics.
Right.
And the overwhelming majority of this funding is directed towards democratic and progressive causes.
Over 99%.
His strategic approach involves targeting not only federal elections through super PACs, but also focusing significantly on state and local races, particularly for district attorney positions, and directly influencing policy outcomes through ballot measures.
A multi-level strategy.
And while his U.S. political spending is substantial, easily in the hundreds of millions in recent years, his international activities through the Open Society Foundations are on an even grander scale, part of that $23 billion plus total, providing support to a vast array of civil society initiatives that align with his open society philosophy around the globe.
That sums it up well, and this leads to a really important question maybe for you, the listener, to think about.
Okay.
Considering the sheer scale and the multifaceted nature of this financial influence, both the partisan U.S. spending and the broader global philanthropy, what are the broader implications? What does it mean for democratic processes and policymaking, not just here in the United States, but also in various contexts around the world? What specific questions does this analysis bring to the surface for you regarding the role of large-scale philanthropy and political spending from individuals like Soros or others in shaping our societies?
Yeah. Good questions.
It's definitely worth considering the interconnectedness of these domestic and international efforts and thinking about the potential long-term impact of these very significant strategically deployed investments. What does it mean when one person can direct so much money towards shaping policy and politics?